Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Big Issues in Biodiversity Science webinar. I'm Owen Nevin, CEO here at WABSI, and in opening this meeting, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, dispersed around the country today. I'm coming to you from Canberra on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, many of you in Perth in Western Australia, on the lands of the Noongar people, traditional owners across Australia. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge traditional owners joining us in this meeting today, wherever you join us from. It's a very important part of our positioning and understanding of environment in Australia to acknowledge the many millennia, 60,000 years of continuous management of country by the traditional owners, and the privilege that we have to join them in managing country for the future. Today's webinar is looking at the issue of AI as an emerging technology in biodiversity conservation, this notion of tech for nature, and promises to be a very stimulating pair of presentations today. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function in the meeting, and at the end, after we've had both presentations, we'll have Bistra and Daniel answer some of those questions and engage in some conversation as we usually do. For those that don't know WABSI, the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute, we're an organisation that is established to promote and facilitate collaboration among the research community in Western Australia to meet the big challenges facing biodiversity in our state, and answer the questions that enable industry, government and community to function in a way that is sustainable, bringing a prosperous and diverse future for our state, and preserving our biodiversity. We're a joint venture partnership of 4 universities, 4 government departments, CSIRO, which is the Commonwealth's Science and Industry Research Organisation, and the West Australian Museum. So we bring a breadth of expertise to those challenging issues, and work with our end users to understand what their questions are, what their needs are in terms of science, work with our research community to understand what the knowledge that already exists and how we might formulate research and science programs to answer those questions and enable our end users to come back to using that information and enabling their work. So a cyclic process which leads to prioritized research programs that are addressing the needs of our stakeholders across the state, and informing discussions nationally and internationally. We're very privileged today to be joined by 2 international speakers. Bistra Dilkna from University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Bistra is the co-director of the Center for AI and Society and is an associate professor of computer science. Bistra will bring some of her research work to us, and we'll follow that up with a presentation from Daniel Stelvio, who's an associate professor of biology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. So without too much further from me, I will hand over to Bistra and stop sharing this screen, and hopefully Bistra will be able to share hers.
Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here, and thank you for the kind introduction, Owen. I'm really looking forward to this webinar to share some of my research and also interact with all the attendees. So I'm sorry, I'm getting some kind of let me just share. Okay. I'm just don't know why I'm having a problem here. Okay.
We've had a few technical problems with Teams in other meetings today, Vistra. So
yeah. So do you see? I'm trying to share, but it's just showing the title of my PowerPoint, but not actually showing the PowerPoint. I don't know if you see anything on your side.
No, we don't see anything yet.
Let me just try it again. I'll stop sharing and I'm gonna start sharing again. And it's just not really allowing me.
Perhaps if we just change the order around a little and let Daniel lead off, and perhaps Vistra, if you could email your presentation to me or to Preeti, we can share from this end and come back to you in a minute or two.
Yep, just give me one last chance to do this. This is okay. I think this is going to work.
Yeah.
So, okay, sorry about this, everybody. So hopefully now you can see my screen, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
So happy to be here. As Owen mentioned, I am Vistra Diolkina. I'm the co-director for the USC Center for AI and Society and Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Southern California. So what is the Center for AI and Society at USC? We were one of the very first centers to focus on AI for social good when it was first established in 2016. But we were likely the very first one that was truly an interdisciplinary venture where the School of Engineering and the School of Social Work at USC came together as equal partners to establish the center and really to focus on advancing the scholarship and application of AI for the well-being of vulnerable communities. In particular, we envision doing that by furthering research and education in responsible and just AI through partnerships with stakeholders, organizations, and policymakers. So the themes that CASE, the Center for AI and Society, focuses on can broadly be organized in 3 themes. And today I would mostly focus on environmental justice. So because a lot of my research falls under this umbrella, in particular, I get inspired by applications in biodiversity and habitat conservation, disaster resilience, and climate change. And what is the common thread among all of those challenging societal problems is that we need to design policy and actions to manage extremely limited resources while trying to achieve the best possible impact, as these are really important endeavors. And so this challenge to design policies with limited resources while maximizing positive impact translates into complex predictive and decision problems. So that's why I believe computer science, and in particular AI, have a huge role to play to help us achieve this goal. And indeed, there's many ways in which one can think how tech, in particular AI, touch on AI for conservation, starting from large amounts of data that we can collect relevant to conservation from various sensors, from camera traps to citizen scientists to remote sensing. And we want to leverage this data to really get insights and knowledge in order to inform policies regarding conservation targets, projections, incentives, and so on. And the way to do this is to leverage some of the modeling techniques that AI has developed, from machine learning to computer vision, to causal models, to solving a complex constraint and optimization problems. And so today we'll see some examples of those intersections. In particular, the 2 broad themes are predictive modeling and then decision making. So under predictive modeling, you can think about asking questions such as, what should I expect? How can I use historic data and samples to train a model to accurately predict the label of unseen data? And in conservation, these kind of predictive models can help us answer questions such as, is this suitable habitat for a given species given the climate variables? Can I predict the land cover of a piece of land from satellite images? Is there going to be a poaching trap in this particular part of the conservation area? Or what routes are wildlife traffickers likely to use? All of these questions we have looked at within our research. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges starting from limited data to biased data to domain shift and leveraging multimodal data. At the same time, the other broad spectrum of questions in conservations are related to decision making, and that means optimization. So the question here is, what action should I take? We need to specify the constraints and the objectives we are trying to maximize, and we want to design a method for effective resource allocation. So some examples of problems like this are, where should I place my limited camera sensors in order to get the best data about species? So that's more on a local sensor placement level. Or on a grander scheme, where should I protect land to maximize biodiversity impacts? Or where should I restore or build overpasses to maximize landscape connectivity? Or where should I send my park rangers to patrol in the conservation areas in order to stop poachers? And finally, another example is, where should I do prescribed burns to reduce wildfire hazards the most? Again, the questions, these resource allocation questions that arise in conservation are extremely challenging. They have complex constraints, they have to capture dynamics, they have often multiple and conflicting objectives. So these problems are not only definitely squarely in the realm of some of the key questions that computer science and AI tries to answer, but they're also not your textbook questions. They're actually really unique in their scale, in their characteristics, and therefore also require advances in the field of AI to be solved. So next, I want to give some examples from the research at the Center for AI in Society. One of the questions we've looked at is, how can we leverage satellite data in order to recognize different land cover types from water, forest, field, or built infrastructure. And one of the key challenges here is that we, in order to inform conservation action, such as, let's say, identifying riparian buffers, we need to really have these land cover maps at extremely high resolution. And often we don't really have good label data at such high resolution, but we have coarser labels or just limited high resolution land cover labels. So we worked together with Microsoft AI for Earth program in order to create the first US-wide high-resolution land cover map. In particular, it was a 1 meter level land cover map across all of the continental US. And we need it in order to do this, we need to innovate. We need to come up with a technique that merged high-resolution imagery with coarse labels and together with very limited number of high-resolution label data. And so with this new technique, we were able to improve the geographic generalization and improve the accuracy to a level where we could feel comfortable to make a product that's available across the US. But once you train this, which is extremely expensive undertaking, how can we make this tailored to specific locales where there could be the model might not be as accurate as needed for the needs of the projects? In order to address this question, which is often overlooked in research, where the last mile problem of actually how do you make these methods or tools or products really fit for purpose for specific projects, we really wanted to allow for this last mile usability of the land cover prediction models. And in order to do this, we created a fine-tuning cover model, which basically could be served through a web-based interactive tool, where the user could apply the model as is to the area where they wanted to get land cover mapping, but then could go in and quickly provide correcting labels for a few pixels and could scope around large swaths of the predictive surfaces and choose, basically analyze what kind of errors the model is making and choose which of the pixels would be most informative in order to correct the kind of errors the land cover mapping deep learning model is making, submit those to the backend, to the model, and quickly refine the model on the fly and be able to repredict and correct again. And this functionality was extremely important in order to improve the generalization but also the fine tuning to specific areas. And so when we actually run this interactive tool with a user study on Mechanical Turk, where we would give different users the chance to do this fine-tuning exercise, we found that humans are extremely good not only at being labelers, which is the usual way in which citizens are kind of used in getting more data, where you just give them, let's say, several things to label and they provide labels for them. But humans are extremely good at being what is called in machine learning the query method. They decide which pixels should be relabeled. So by empowering the users to both decide which pixels to label and then provide the labels themselves, we saw a huge spike in the speed with which these models could be fine-tuned to new places. So currently, this method and tool is used by Microsoft AI for Good with multiple partners across the globe, such as the Chesapeake Bay Conservancy and the World Bank, to inform decisions. Another examples of a predictive model that we've developed in our center is MegaSDM. MegaSDM is an R package, an R tool designed to support species distribution modeling in climate change scenarios. Species distribution modeling and climate projections are a common thing ML use in ecology. There's many papers about different ways of doing it, analysis in different places with different data sets and so on. But what we discovered in my lab when we started working on this is that basically everybody was recoding in R many of these steps. So what we are set to do is to really create a full pipeline of all the steps that are common in doing this kind of analysis, put them into a single package, make them highly parallelizable and highly scalable, so to facilitate future studies. And in addition to that, we also created some additional modules, such as creating what we call time maps, which I'll quickly explain next, and also integrating dispersal limitations in climate projections for species. So what would those things stand for? So time maps are essentially visualizing species projections under climate change across multiple decades into the future in a single map. So instead of having the suitable habitat today, in 30 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, we wanted to be able to use those multiple time steps and be able to see them in a single map in order to quickly synthesize the shrinkage or the expansion in the habitat range of species. So we did that by creating these binary logic maps where pixels which would be persistent through all time steps that are being modeled will be colored, let's say in this case yellow, which means this is a persistent habitat across multiple time steps into the future, versus pixels which are not habitat today in 2010, but will be habitat in the future, have a different logic. So these are expansion zones and they're colored in blue, and the ones in orange and red are the shrinkage contraction zone. So this basically allowed here on the left to see for these species in a single map, these 3 different time steps, and kind of understand the fact that There's some areas that are expansions, other contractions, and some stable habitat. Now, in addition to that, Mega SDM also supports a really important constraint projection modeling, where instead of only looking at the climate impact into the future, we also look into whether the habitat is actually reachable within that many years into the future, given the dispersal limits for the species. Some pixels that become habitable into the future are too far away for the species to be able to move fast enough to occupy these future habitats. And for some dispersal limited species, when you take those constraints into account, the projections, as you can see for this specific species, become very different. And this was the key thing that we highlighted in our work, where we basically identified the fact that future projections for specific species and the biodiversity as a whole could look extremely different when we combine the impacts both of climate as well as the ecology, the dispersal limits of the species. So in these combined plots where we do this analysis for 165 mammal species in North America, you can see that the biodiversity predicted without dispersal limits differs quite a bit with the one with the dispersal limits. In particular, in the bottom orange plot, you can see the differences in the projected biodiversity hotspots. So this is about predictive modeling, but I want to focus the rest of my talk on decision making. In particular, conservation actions is extremely important given the quick habitat loss and fragmentation that we have observed in the last decades, due to mostly anthropogenic factors such as urbanization, deforestation, and agriculture, and in the future, even more so with climate change. So effective conservation planning is extremely important, and yet we have limited resources and limited time to take those actions. So I want to share with you some recent work where we have focused on how can we expand the current approaches to spatial conservation planning using optimization techniques to incorporate institutional hierarchies or governance. This is joint work with my collaborators from many different universities, in particular done with funding from NSF in University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So what does conservation planning models do? They provide optimization models that identify a combination of parcels or projects that we think we should implement that collectively offer the greatest improvement in biodiversity outcomes while respecting costs and budget constraints. So such conservation planning optimization models are increasingly being used to inform conservation action and being applied to large-scale spatially explicit initiatives. So it's extremely important to make those models effective, scalable, but also to make them richer, to capture more of the dynamics and true, complex components of this decision-making. And one specific dimension that is largely ignored is the institutional or governance structure that exists in practicing conservation. So most models basically assume a single planner acting over a whole region, a single decision maker that is going to decide how to spend the limited money in order to decide where to protect. Or sometimes maybe takes into account multiple independent planners, but thinks of each of them as acting simultaneously with no coordination. But in fact, in most settings, conservation action is through a collaborative governance structure that basically consists of a layer of interacting conservation actors. So, and those conservation actors can be focused on different but connected priorities. They can operate over different scales, or they can be used different instruments or different approaches to conservation. Here is one example from the US, which makes this very obvious. We have the federal government, which allocates budgets across all of US, and they allocate budgets in particular to the states. So they make decisions at the state level. And federal conservation priorities are aligned with protecting endangered species, federally listed endangered species. Now, the states, when they get this money, the state planners are the ones to actually make decisions to protect specific locations. And in those decisions of allocating these resources, they consider state conservation priorities. So they might include keystone species or other locally important species that are considered high priority from the point of view of the local stakeholders. So here we have an example of two-layered governance structure. So how we basically wanted to create a model that's able to capture this layered hierarchies, and we used insights from game theory in order to design such a methodology. We considered federal grant-giving states to be represented as a stackable game. In stackable game, you basically have one actor which moves first, that's called the leader, and then the other actors or players which respond, these are the followers, that can only take actions after the leader has taken his. So in our case, the leader, the government wants to allocate budgets. They decide just money, pockets of money, and they want to do that by endogenizing the anticipated behavior of the followers, which in our case will be the states or regions. And the leader wants to do that to still maximize the leader's conservation utility. Here is a mathematical presentation of this. We want to maximize the utility of the leader, but he has to take into account the fact of what are going to the individual regions going to do. The leader can only decide what budgets to allocate to each region up to maximum budget, and then after the budget is allocated, each of the individual users or regions are going to make their own allocation decisions, maximizing their own utility subject to the allocated budgets that the leader gave them. In our case, the utility of the leader is some kind of biodiversity objective, which they want to maximize the persistence of several species they care about based on how much habitat is conserved across all of the regions under the federal government, while each individual state wants to maximize their biodiversity based on some other utility function, again, based on their own decisions. So in order to apply and illustrate the performance of this conservation planning methodology, we used the continental US as a case study, where again, the players are the federal government as the leader, the states as the followers, and the spatially explicit decision that the states make is to decide for each county within each state how much land to conserve there. Here, the utilities of the government is to protect the Endangered Species Act, the species listed under the Endangered Species Act, while each state wants to protect the species listed under the state action plans, which basically each state in the US has. We combine this with data on costs of conservation and other information that we have. So as I mentioned, so here is visually on the map, the federally listed threatened and endangered species based on the number across the US versus for each state, the relevant local state important species, the swap listed species, and finally the cost of conservation per county. So you can see that there is a lot of spatial heterogeneity and a lot of misalignment between the federal utilities and the state level utilities. That is why it's so important to create models that are able to incorporate both of these perspectives into a single framework for conservation decision making. So if the federal model was basically implemented based on the currently existing conservation optimization models, which just assume there's going to be a single decision maker and they're going to maximize their own utility, assuming that essentially the federal government can tell where a land to be conserved explicitly down to the county level, this is where they would choose to protect land based on the federally listed endangered species and the cost of the available land for conservation. However, this is not realizable in a sense that they cannot directly go and protect on the county level. And if they were to distribute this amount of money as it goes into each state would then take this budget and reallocate it based on their own priorities. And so the actual realized outcome of budgets that ignore the institutions will see this kind of spatial allocation. So clearly you can see there's misalignment between the two. Now, when using our bi-level approach with endogenized decision-making between both levels, then we would see a much better alignment based on the final outcome with the idealized solution where the federal government could go directly and maximize its utility. In terms of, I will skip this slide for interest of time. In terms of numbers, basically, if we were to allocate naively ignoring institutions, we'll give away 24% of the maximum possible biodiversity that such a program could hope for. So basically, if we could have this idealized solution, we would get like a total of 1 versus with the naive solution, we lose 24%. And when we institute our bi-level model accounting for these hierarchies, we can gain back and reduce the possible efficiency cost associated with governance by 1/3. So we think that this is a big win because, again, given limited resources, we don't want to leave anything on the table by not including these different dynamics. I don't know how I'm doing on time. So in the last 2 slides, I guess I want to mention the other second biggest threat to biodiversity after habitat loss and fragmentation, which is illegal wildlife trade. Illegal poaching, trafficking, and trade of animals is a big problem, and it's indeed the second biggest threat to biodiversity. It threatens animal populations, ecotourism, security, and health. And it basically involves trapping animals and then trafficking them to locations where they are being demanded. And this is happening at large scales, including 1 million pangolins being trafficked over the last 10 years as an estimate based on how many pangolin scales have been seized over the last decade. So can AI also help in this aspect of biodiversity conservation? I believe so, and in particular, AI and optimization can help in multiple ways. It can help in detecting poaching, so stopping the crime before it even occurs in conservation areas by basically training machine learning models to predict where traps will be placed by poachers, and also using decision models to route the more effectively patrol rangers in those conservation areas. We could use AI models to predict trafficking routes, not only outside of the conservation areas once the poached animals have left the area where they were killed, and we can optimize in prediction efforts. So in our group, we have worked on developing ML models to predict likely trafficking routes. In particular, we compiled data, all publicly available data on seizures on the airline network across the globe. We combine information for all the in an ML model that trying to predict from a given origin to a given destination airport, which is the likely flight path that the trafficker would take. With this model, we were able to identify some of the key drivers or characteristics of airports that might play a role in the trafficker's decision-making, which highlighted things like human trafficking, arms and trafficking, criminal networks, and money laundering. And in particular, since seizure data is very limited, our model is able to predict over the whole network, which means it's able also to suggest very likely alternative routes that have not been yet identified or recorded in the existing seizure records as possible locations where trafficking might be occurring. Now, in addition to this, we also develop optimization models to deploy limited anti-trafficking resources by basically suggesting how to optimize interdiction resources across airports again, given models of trafficker behaviors to maximize the disruption to the trafficking trade. And finally, a new project that is ongoing that started last year is a large-scale collaboration between the Florida International University, University of Maryland, Oxford, USC, Aribada, ZSL, and Pargabon to try to save the most trafficked animal in the world, which is the pangolins, with a 4 million grant from the Paul Allen Family Foundation, where we are going to be working in an interdisciplinary team of ecologists, conservation criminologists, AI experts, and technology developers to gather data and develop models to understand pangolin poaching and trafficking, and develop models to try to inform decision making. So with that, I want to conclude by saying biodiversity is in crisis. AI Noir can have a potential impact by using our powerful arsenal of techniques in order to inform conservation action. And it's a two-way street. Not only AI can help conservation, but also conservation can help AI by posing new challenging problems and developing my study area further and expanding the science of computer science. So with that, thank you. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Bistra. That was a really informative journey through some of the applications of AI, and I think that will certainly lead to many of our participants having questions for us. So just to remind people, if you pop the questions into the chat function. I did say Q&A at the beginning, but that's not working. So drop them in the chat and we'll pick them up from there. And we'll come back to Bistra at the end with some questions. And I'll hand over now to Danielle.
All right. Yeah. Cool. Yes. Thank you very much for the introduction earlier. A super cool talk we just heard. So the bar is pretty high, but I'll try to present a bit of the work that we're doing in my group. So I'm a computational biologist in this various institution. Okay.
We're just seeing the screen that has
really?
Your next slide and things on it. So I think the presentation.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, let me just click this. Oh, I guess I was showing. Yeah, can you see my slide now?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, so yeah, I'm a computational biologist. In our group, we try to develop new AI models and other probabilistic approaches to understand how biodiversity has changed in evolutionary times, then in recent times, and then how it may change in the future. And so we think that it's quite important to actually look at how biodiversity changed over time, because it helps us in the past, because it helps us to really quantify the magnitude of the biodiversity crisis today. And so some of the data that we look at is actually fossil data, and then that allow us to go back millions of years, really, to see how the history of entire lineages of the tree of life have evolved and changed over time. And one of the problems that we have when we look at fossil data is that the fossil data are very sparse and incomplete, and even groups of organisms that have a great fossil record, like elephants, will have lots of gaps and spatial biases. And so some of the development that we do is tailoring AI models to deal with these sparse data and use the data in this modeling to estimate diversity trajectories through time. How does the sample diversity that we observe in the fossil record translate into a true or a prediction of the true biodiversity? And what we observe when we run these models, for example, on this group of elephants, today there are only 3 species of elephants left, 2 in Africa and 1 in Asia. But there used to be many more elephant species until very recently. So this blue trajectory here shows the diversity of elephants globally is obtained through a deep learning model. And we can see that elephants have a very long evolutionary history. So they have been around since basically just after the extinction of dinosaurs, so 60 plus million years. They were doing pretty well for the last 20 million years with like as many as 40 species globally distributed, not in Australia, but in all other continents. And then there was this massive drop in diversity, like a 10-fold decrease in diversity that happened in a very recent amount of time, yes, in less than 1 million years, which put in evolutionary terms is a very, very short time. And then we can use other AI paper that actually was published yesterday. Explainable AI to try and figure out why the elephants went extinct. And so we estimated extinction rates through time, and you can see in this curve on the left, the magnitude of the increase in extinction rate. So extinction rate basically quantifies the expected number of species that will go extinct in a time unit per lineage. And you see that there is an increase of orders of magnitude that happens in the very, very recent. And using explainable AI, we can also attribute this increase in extinction rate to basically spatial and temporal overlap with humans. So humans, rather than other factors like climate change, past climate change, I should say, humans were the main driver of extinction for this group of megafauna, right? These like huge herbivores. But even if we look at beyond elephants and across all mammals, we see that we see using unsupervised models, we can estimate this increase in extinction rate by orders of magnitude, and these happen across all mammals. So here the curves on the left show the diversity of mammals as it is in the last 126,000 years ago. So this is not this is a much shallower time frame here that we're looking at, and the extinction rates increased 1,700 times. We can also use posterior predictive models to identify that, again, humans are behind these extinctions. So lots of things went extinct, sadly, but most of
I think we're just having a little bit of a connection problem to Daniel at the moment. A second or two to re-engage. Oh. While we just wait for Daniel to reconnect, I see that we've got some questions and answers flowing in the chat. So thank you for keeping that active as we move through. Daniel's dropped out, so let's just give it a moment or two for him to return.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, welcome back, Daniel. We lost you there for a second.
Teams froze. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened, but okay, I'll try again. All right. So let me get started again. Yeah, so we're looking at past extinction events to try and quantify the magnitude of extinction risk or extinction increases recent. But thankfully, while a lot of species went extinct already, there are many that are left and many that can be saved still. So it's not too late for most of diversity. And so it's important to look at the present state of biodiversity, and we think AI can help with that. The gold standard for evaluating species extinction risk across species today is the red list compiled by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And the IUCN red list is a great tool for conservation because it quantifies for thousands of species along this scale here. It quantifies whether species are least confined and whether species are actually endangered. So while this tool is great, it is also still incomplete because it takes a lot of time, effort, and knowledge to actually evaluate these species and their conservation status. In particular, this database is biased towards animals and toward vertebrates in particular. So if you're interested in birds and mammals, all of them have been assessed. But if you look at other groups of organisms that are actually much more diverse than vertebrates, then the level of assessment is much lower. So we have only 7% of plants that have been assessed, around 2% of invertebrates that have been assessed, and a negligible fraction of fungi that have been assessed. So if we want to have a more complete picture of extinction risks today, then we need to be able to scale up our ability to predict extinction risks. And so we've been working on this and trying to complement this red list assessment with other types of data that are instead available worldwide and for many more species than the ones that have been assessed by the red list. In particular, we use databases of biological occurrences, like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, that includes billions of records of living species worldwide. And then we can also overlay this type of data with human footprint estimates or conservation areas data. So we can combine all of this information and use them in predictive models. And we implemented this in an R package we published a couple of years ago that basically compiles all of this available data and tries to map them onto, using deep learning, map them onto predictions of extinction risks. This is useful because it can be trained with red list data, so with the available red list data, but then it can be scaled up to basically any number of species that have occurrence data in these massive databases. And we showcase this application of the IUCN R package by looking into 49,000 of species of trees, which is almost all the tree species that are out there, for which we are able to compile 23 million occurrences using these databases and translate these occurrences into predictions. And so we were able to create extinction risk estimates for 49,000 species of trees, which we were then able to map, for example, geographically, but also across different groups of tree species and so on. So we estimated that about 40% of trees may be threatened with extinction today. Unlike a lot of AI research that is driven by industry, we are not only interested in the accuracy of our predictions, which we can test with our validation and test sets, but we're also interested in the uncertainty around our predictions. And so we can use different techniques to evaluate areas, for example, where our predictions are less likely to be accurate. For example, here we identify this area as being a high uncertainty area, which means that we would need to collect more data, more biological data to actually make our models better and more accurate for these regions. So we can use AI to estimate the dynamics of past extinction. We can use AI to predict which species may be threatened with extinction today. But then can AI actually help us tackling the ongoing biodiversity crisis? So can we use AI to actually guide conservation action. And this is something that we developed in a new software. Then this is a team effort that involved me and Alex Antonelli, who's the director of science at Kew Gardens, Thomas Turner, who's an environmental economics professor, and then Stefano Goria, who's a theoretical physicist and tech developer. So here we developed a new software that allows us to guide conservation and restoration action using a particular type of AI that is called reinforcement learning. So this tool is this was published a couple of years ago, and it's been in development since. The tool is called Captain for Conservation Area Prioritization through Artificial Intelligence, and it's implementing a dynamic system where you have an environment that describes everything that we know about biodiversity, but also about socioeconomic data. I'll give some examples in a bit. Threats to environments. Then this environment is observed by an agent that is basically the brains of the software and takes the place of the policymaker. So the agent observes the environment and translates this environment into a conservation or restoration action. This process will go over time steps. So it's a process that evolves over time, where the environment changes over time as a function of, for example, climate change, changes in anthropogenic pressures on the environment, but also as a function of the actions that the agent is taking. And the agent learns from this environment and optimizes the way it translates what it sees in the environment and how it translates this into an action. This process is called reinforcement learning. And so the environment is going to look like this, where you have species ranges. You can have thousands of species. Species can be attributed to traits that describe, for example, their sensitivity to threats, their ability to disperse, their growth rates. They can be assigned to extinction risk if this information is available. If not, it can be imputed or predicted. But in the environment, there will be also a budget. There will be the costs of protecting or restoring land, and information about the land use or human footprint on different places. So this is a spatially explicit model where you have a simulation that tries to reconstruct what happens to real species as you change the environment. The agent, this policymaker, will observe all of these multidimensional data and through a neural network translate it into an action. The action will select, for example, the next area for protection or for conservation. And this can be done at any spatial resolution principle. Selecting an action means that we will, for example, remove or decrease disturbance, anthropogenic pressure from a particular area. And so this will have a consequence on the environment. So this action will reflect on the environment. They will change over time as a consequence of this action. So, for example, some species may recover within this region that is now protected. The budget that we have available for conservation will decrease as a consequence of the cost of this action, and so on. So this action will lead to an updated environment, and the environment is then observed again by the agent, by the policymaker. And based on the updated environment, the agent will collect a reward. You can think of it as the score in a video game. So the reward will be a positive reward if the action was good, and we can define what good is. For example, good means that no species went extinct in the process, or good could mean that species improved in their conservation status. So we can define the reward according to our optimization objective. So based on this reward, the agent will do some parameter optimization and select the next action. The next action will again reflect on the environment, and then this cycle will go on until the budget is used up. The agent will start not knowing what it's doing. So this neural network will do terrible decisions in the beginning, but we basically make the agent play this game where the game is really protecting nature over and over again. And in the process, the agent will learn how to deal with these multidimensional data and how to best translate it into conservation action. The system is very flexible, both in the type of data that you can feed it with, and also in the type of reward and objectives that you define when you run these models. So you can have a reward system based on maximizing biodiversity outcomes. You can have a reward system based on maximizing carbon outcomes or minimizing costs, things like this. You can also combine different objectives and use them to evaluate trade-offs between different metrics. We tested first this software with an empirical data set of 1,500 species of endemic trees in Madagascar, for which we had the distribution, which we overlaid with socioeconomic data that we use to approximate anthropogenic pressure on the environment. And we ran this type of data through Captain and obtain a map of conservation priority as predicted by this AI algorithm. We can also benchmark this algorithm against state-of-the-art or naive policies, and we did that both using simulations and using empirical data, and we found that the outcomes are significantly better when we use this AI algorithm compared to naive policies. For example, if you just protect the most biodiverse areas, you end up doing a terrible job at protecting all of the species that need protection. But even if you use conservation planning tools like Marksan, that is one of the most widely used non-AI approaches to conservation planning, we found that with this empirical data set, using the same conditions, same budget, our approach was able to protect all of the species and in a larger fraction of their geographic range. So even though these AI approaches can be computationally intensive, I think they are worth it. We can also use Captain to evaluate the effect of applying policies globally versus regionally. I think we heard a lot of really interesting things from the previous talk about this. And it's a really interesting question to see how like a top-down approach to conservation versus more like a decentralized approach to conservation, what the trade-offs between these two approaches could be. And we can use Captain to do this, for example, by allocating budget globally and then distributing the budget based on a global policy. And comparing this with a more fair allocation of budget, where like the budget is allocated, for example, here among regions more uniformly, in applying conservation, regional conservation policies. We can see in the outcomes that the global conservation policy will have a slight outcome, so it will be able to, but this will come at a societal level, because then it means that the spending on conservation will be very heterogeneously distributed. The amount of protected area per region will also be very heterogeneously distributed, which means also that the benefits linked to having a nice green area around you will be very heterogeneously distributed. So applying a regional policy will lead to some trade-off in terms of biodiversity outcome, but it will lead to a much more uniform, fair distribution of resources and protection. So I think having this tool allows us to evaluate these trade-offs. Another way to use this approach is to evaluate the possible consequences of different implementations of policies that governments have agreed on. For example, in this 30 by 30 agreement that was signed up by almost 200 countries in 2022, there is a big, there is a big pledge of like protecting or restoring 30% of land and marine areas by 2030. This is an amazing opportunity for nature and for people. But the question is then like, well, which 30% should be protected or restored? And what are the consequences of implementing these through different policies? So we ran a number of experiments through simulations using Captain to evaluate the possible outcomes of different implementations of a 30 by 30 policy. And we did this through simulations where we had a bunch of biodiversity data, costs of conservation, simulated habitat degradation. So these like artificial data, but we use this as a way to benchmark different implementations of the 30 by 30. And we apply different implementations, one based on a minimum cost approach. So let's try to do the 30% that is the cheapest thing that we can do. We compare this with a maximum biodiversity policy where we just protect the places with the highest biodiversity. We use some other metrics like the mean species abundance as a metric to guide this 30%. This MSA is something that is used a lot in industry for environmental impact disclosure. And then we compare this with our Captain optimized policy. We can then evaluate the outcome of this policy because these are simulated data sets, so we know everything about the data and we can just evaluate what happens under different implementations of the 30 by 30. So what do we end up with at the end of this implementation? And we can compare this through different metrics, so we can check how much did all of these policies cost, how much were they able to increase the intactness of the environment, how much were they able to reduce the threats, the overall threats as calculated by this star metric, and how much of the critical endangered species did we manage to protect sufficiently. And so we took the minimum cost policy as our comparison and then calculated basically the change compared to a minimum cost policy across the other policies. So these numbers here represent the percentage change compared to a minimum cost policy. And the first thing that we observe is that no matter which other policy you do, any other policy will cost more than a minimum cost policy. So this is not surprising, but it also means that if we want to protect nature, this is not going to be cheap. The other good thing or interesting thing that we observe is that any policy will do better than a minimum cost policy. So basically, going for the cheapest areas will lead to the worst biodiversity outcome. We also noticed that our AI optimized conservation strategy was able to have the best outcome in terms of reducing threats. It was able to protect the best level threatened species, so the species that need most protection. So even though there are some other metrics like biodiversity proxies and these MSA methods that are cheaper to calculate in a sense, they don't require necessarily a lot of data, they don't require a lot of computation, but I think there is still value in applying more complex models with more data because it does end up with better biodiversity outcomes. And I want to finish with a real case scenario that is still work in progress, but this is the work that we are doing with people in New Zealand. And Ashley Rode and Michelle Guevara are the developers of this project with me. And so here we're applying Captain within a 30 by 30 scenario, but across marine areas in New Zealand. And so here we really used compiled real data. We obtained species distribution maps for almost 600 marine species across different groups of fish, invertebrates, even plants. For each of these species, we were able to compile conservation status. So we don't only know their suitable habitat, but we also know their conservation status. We have information about their sensitivity to disturbance. We have estimated abundances, and we also generated future habitat suitability based on climate change, which will change not only temperature, but also oxygen availability in water. So we are able to feed Captain with all of this data and combine this data with other types of data. For example, where they describe, for example, where the human pressure is on the environment. So we have data about mining and oil, we have data about fishing pressure, but we also have data about the total cash value, opportunity costs, right? Like how much does it cost if we prevent fishing from different areas? I should say that these data are not real data because the real data are cannot be disclosed at this point. But so we combine all of these multidimensional data and implemented our captain optimization and make it develop through time and identify the 30% marine areas that will protect at best biodiversity. So this is the map that we obtained after optimizing our model. So we were able to identify the top priority 30% across the territorial waters of New Zealand. You can see that there is some gradient between low and high priority. This actually reflects the uncertainties that we have. Again, like we're interested not only in getting the point estimate here, the point prediction, but we also want to know which areas may or may not be necessary for like best protecting biodiversity. And so we account for uncertainties also in the data, for example, on dispersal ability of species that we have information for, but we are not certain about the exact value. So we can run this model multiple times and create an ensemble of solutions, which is what I'm showing here. Through these predicted or through this optimization of conservation areas, we found that at the end of the simulation, so by 2030, our predictions quantify at 80% the reduction in a number of threatened species. So if we were to implement really this type of conservation scheme, we predicted the number of threatened species would reduce by 80%. We also found that under this conservation planning, we have that all species fall under some protected areas, and all species fall in at least 90 grid cells of protected area. And we also noticed that there is here, we didn't use the available and currently existing marine protected areas because we wanted to see what the model would tell us without any constraints. And we found that there is only a 9% overlap between our solution and the current marine protected areas, which means that there is definitely room for adjustment of the current marine protected areas. We also compared this optimization against another approach that has been increasingly used, that is called the STAR metric, this species threat abatement and restoration metric. And we found that this STAR method actually identified areas that are quite different from the ones that we find. But compared to a STAR solution, Captain was able to lead to a 30% reduction in the predicted number of threatened species and a significant improvement in predicted species recovery. So if we quantify recovery as the potential disappeared fraction, so like we found that this disappeared fraction reduced by 2.6 fold in our Captain solution, meaning that species are recovering much more under this distribution of conservation areas compared to this one. Also, the STAR metric was not able to, or did not select areas that protected all species and left basically 240 species unprotected under this setting. So Captain and is a good potential to actually guide conservation by conservation action by allowing us to include many different types of data, so biological data, but also data linked to socioeconomical information. We can incorporate changes through time as well in our optimization, so we can use climate projections, land use changes, or predicted changes in human pressure. And we can use this approach to also measure trade-offs between different conservation or policy objectives. So we can measure a trade-off between costs and biodiversity, between carbon and biodiversity, and so on. So overall, and with this I finish, we're trying to use the AI in different ways to quantify how biodiversity has changed in deep time, how biodiversity has changed in recent times due to human impacts, and how biodiversity loss may be improved and bended through action in the future. And so with this, I would like to thank some of the funding agencies that are supporting some of my work, my collaborators, and you all for listening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was fascinating, a journey from the deep past to the potential future. So that probably leads into a fairly open-ended question for both you and Bistra. You've given us the state of the art, and you're working in this space which is rapidly changing and rapidly advancing. Given your experience to date, where do you see the next big advances occurring in AI for nature, and what do you think are the sort of the frontiers that you'd like to see explored? Maybe go to Bistra first, since Daniel's having a drink.
Well, it's twofold. One is more about taking the AI breakthroughs that we've already connected to possible conservation, outcomes and uses, and really making them being used. I think we're still very far away from this, what I mentioned as the last mile problem of AI research. It's a lot in academic papers, in use case studies, with carefully curated data, and we are very far away from this being, routinely and easily and effectively used by decision makers all the time. So I would really, really like to see AI being integrated in a very effective way with different kind of decision makers and organizations. So that's one side. And the other side about the breakthroughs, there are a couple of things. One of the things about that I mentioned early in my talk is we're collecting more and more data and sensor data. And we've gotten better, for example, of doing, let's say, species distribution models with observations from camera traps, etc. But the big breakthrough that still hasn't really made the full force of it using conservation is multimodal predictive models, which are able to really fuse and use data from satellite to images to audio to citizen science all at once. And there's been a lot of progress in multimodal machine learning and AI for non-conservation applications. So maybe this is one technology that can come in soon. And obviously the big elephant in the room, large language models. There is also possible ways to leverage this for conservation as well. And I'm hoping that people that are experts in this area of AI would also care enough to think about innovative ways to connect this to conservation.
Excellent, thank you. Daniel, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that was said before. There are lots of opportunities, I think, coming up in data gathering as well. So there is all these technologies now to get data from LiDAR, remote sensing, and so the amount of data will increase substantially, I think, in the future, and also the amount of resolution. There are good ways now to predict, for example, carbon using LiDAR data, which is useful because then you can use carbon as a way to, for example, do conservation with some level of profit, because you can sell carbon credits while you also restore nature. So there are opportunities there. I think large models, these massive models, are very useful. I think there is still room for small models, which for some types of data sets are still useful, because not all biodiversity data is big data. Most of biodiversity in biological data, I think, is actually small data compared to AI, industry standards. And so certainly these massive models that can only be trained in special facilities like by OpenAI and Microsoft, these are certainly very useful, but I think there is still room for scientific research that can make more portable models very tailored to specific issues and questions. So whereas we can use this almost general AI for many things, I think there is still room for developing smaller models that are specific to particular questions. And this is partly what we're doing in our group, really developing our own little AI that does one thing, but hopefully does it well.
Okay. Following on from that a little bit, sort of a linked question, and that Bistra, you touched on, it's that multimodal model learning. And I think one of the things that you touched on in your presentation, Daniel, and also in yours, Bistra, is that combination of types of data. So the socioeconomic with the occurrence, with the is that an area where there's particular utility in the use of machine learning and AI? So the combining of different types of data to support answering questions at the same time.
I think AI has been instrumental in like making us able to use these different types of data. I think before these models came along, I think it was really a major challenge to combine data of different sorts. And this has been now, I think it's become no longer really an issue. Like there are still, you still have to be kind of smart about how you do it, but AI has really paved the way for like using any types of data, from images to environmental DNA data to even language, right? You can, if you have like species descriptions, you could feed them through language models into the same architecture. So I think there is really, the opportunities are enormous, and they were brought up by AI, and it's really about combining everything that we have, right? All sorts of data that are available.
Yeah, and I think what the key thing is that each of those data streams individually, the first thing it does, it passes through, often through an AI model that's meant to, ingest that particular data. Let's say camera trap images go through a computer vision models that do like recognition of species in images, or they go through like a deep learning architecture that takes satellite imagery and does like net cover mapping, right? So each one of them have their own like pipeline, but then after that also combining them into a joint data set, while at the same time recognizing that they're coming from different modalities and explicitly modeling for that. I think there's like a big scope of applying this kind of data, again, multimodal data that don't treat, let's say, all of the recognitions of like species detection as species detection, no matter whether it came from a trap or from an audio or so on, but actually could even leverage the information that they're coming from different types of sensors, right? And explicitly modeling for that. Because obviously each sensor has its own uncertainty, its own stuff that it comes with. So yeah, they definitely, as I mentioned earlier, I believe there's a big opportunity and that's underexplored.
Excellent. And one that probably has a quick answer of hopefully yes. There's a question here around, can these models, we've talked about optimizing for conservation, and the questions around weeds and ferals and invasives. Do you see that these tools could be used for optimizing actions that lead to extirpation or removal of species, particularly thinking in that case about weeds and invasive species? And I would assume, yes, that's just a case of parameterizing differently. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. I mean, as every, effective methodology on the abstract level, a lot of questions, whether you're predicting things that are beneficial or you're predicting things that are harmful, the same underlying ML technology will be a good learning technology to do effective predictive modeling. And similarly with decision making, if you can optimize to maximize your objective under limited resources, you can be maximizing conservation objectives, or you can be maximizing the opposite. So
yeah. I think in the context of removing weeds and invasives, that removing them is a positive for conservation at the end of the outcome. So another question, which takes us in maybe a different direction. Do you see ways of implementing this AI modeling to support the development of a sense of urgency around conservation and use these emerging tools to act as actually communication of urgency and the need for action to a broader public? So not just to the decision makers, but sort of decision support for the voter, I suppose.
I mean, it
I
could
start, maybe I think they well. Go ahead.
Sorry, Daniel, you were breaking up a little bit and we couldn't hear you. But let me address in the meantime. Yeah. I was recently serving on a panel which was focusing on, it was a conference for nonprofits here in the Los Angeles area. And I was serving on a panel on AI for nonprofits. And that's exactly, I was really surprised, although I shouldn't have been surprised to hear, but a lot of the nonprofits that were present there were really excited and overall already leveraging LLMs to improve their footprint, right? So basically using them to help them with writing effective communication or grant proposal or social media. And they were essentially saying we are so understaffed and now we can, use these tools to help us do much more with the little people that we have on board, right? And so from that perspective, I think this is really positive. And not only that, but from my point of view, for like the general user, one of the big things is that exactly a lot of the, let's say, conservation policy or even conservation literature status is hard to comprehend or even to access or even to query for a regular user. If you go to Google search and you do something, you get papers, but who can read academic papers? So having, let's say, an LLM-based like assistant to help you understand conservation in the area you are based on basically digesting all of this formal literature would be something that I think could be extremely impactful in informing people about conservation. Obviously, the threat, the risk is that we still know that these tools are very far from perfect, right? And sometimes they hallucinate information or they misattribute and so on. And so one has to also be very careful, because if somebody is not vetting what information is or how information is being summarized or presented, then that could also result in unintended consequences.
Excellent.
Maybe adding to that, I think like one way I think to raise the alarm for like the urgency of conservation for us has been to really compare what is happening today with what happened in the past. Really like looking at like the magnitude of the change, right? Because like if extinction rates have increased like 1,000 times, this is something that I think resonates with the public. Even if you don't have an understanding of how this was estimated, it doesn't matter. Like, I mean, it's still something, and you can use this extinction rate to make predictions of like how many more species we will lose under, business as usual scenario. And these are things that I think like scare people enough that they start to care about biodiversity, hopefully. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for your presentations today and for taking those questions and the really informative discussion. I think it's been really beneficial to see what can be achieved and think about how that can be moved forward. It's also really nice to see some quite detailed and specific discussion in the sidebar as we went down, and hopefully the foundations of some future partnerships there in that discussion. So thank you to both of our presenters, and thank you to all who have participated. On the screen, you'll see a QR code to a survey. We're always trying to improve and bring our participants webinars that are useful in a format that's helpful. So please do take a quick screenshot of that link and follow up with the short survey online to help us develop future sessions in this series. Speaking of future sessions, the next two scheduled presentations in the series are in August, on the 16th of August. We've got big issues in inspiring careers, which is focused for Science Week. It's Science Week here in Australia that week, and it's focusing on career opportunities for sort of late high school, undergraduate, early postgraduate target audience for that one. So a little bit different from our usual target audience, but bringing to you some of our outstanding and inspiring career stories from partner organizations. And then coming in October, measuring and valuing nature, bringing some thoughts around economics of biodiversity, financing of nature conservation, and really a lead in to the Global Nature Positive Summit, which will be the following week in Sydney. So bringing the first deliverables from our new program area in biodiversity, economics and finance to the table to move forward that discussion and prepare us for the events of the following week. Without too much further, again, thanking our presenters. We will circulate the recording to all those that registered to the event. So you'll be able to look back and catch up on those bits that you missed or share with colleagues. Thank you.